Berckenhoff, and this is the second episode of my podcast, where essentially I'm going to be talking over a few ideas on recent/current events within the news of today's politics and policies and anything relating to that as a field. In today's episode, a lot is talk is going to be over the COVID-19 and the news around all that, as government keeps wanting to people to wear masks, and Walmart and chains like that are also making stances that it's mandatory to wear masks, and there might even be a new vaccine out, or a potential vaccine to COVID-19 in the very early stages of testing. We are also going to discuss a little bit over some recent Trump news and things we're talking over Trump. And then we're also going to be talking about Biden versus Trump in the political race, and maybe Biden's vice president candidates he has for his field so far. And then we're going to end with a little bit of Redskins news and other things relating to the Redskins as a franchise. And just so everybody's caught up to date, this podcast is on current events, as I've just said, but it is also live streamed to my YouTube channel, Roundtable Decision, and my DLive, Roundtable Decision, as well as my Twitch channel, Roundtable Talk. And after I live stream this podcast, it will go up, as you can see here, on my Apple Podcast, along with Spotify, Google Podcasts, and any other podcasting platform you might listen to your podcast from. So now that we're kind of all caught up to date, I thought I would first like to introduce some announcements before we move on to the main topics in our podcast today. So Freedom Scoop is a network that I'm a part of, and Freedom Scoop is a bunch of individual content creators such as Ed, Stephen and Garamus, the R-Rated Conservative, Freckles and Brit Show, among others. And we all are set to introduce content through the views of how we view news or any other political event. And ultimately, we are trying to give new perspectives, or at least our own perspectives, on mass media events, because we do not think that mass media does a good job at showing all sides to a story and just showing a very limited perspective along with it. So if you like my content through this podcast, or you're interested in the idea of individual content creators, you should check out Freedom Scoop and check out any one of their channels, as I think you might enjoy it, especially if you enjoy the content you hear today. And again, that is freedomscoop.com. Now let's go to the first event that I want to cover for today's news. But just before I bounce into that, I thought I would quickly mention that I will be gone for 12 days after this podcast has aired. But on those 12 days, I do plan to release some videos on my YouTube channel, Roundtable Decision, of solo videos introducing ideas and topics I have always kind of wanted to talk about. And those are such as philosophy topics and mass media news, trustable type of content as well. Basically, I'm going to be discussing certain events that I've always wanted to discuss, and I decided that I was going to save it for when I was gone to publish on individual videos rather than publishing when I'm here. So I won't be having a podcast through those 12 days as again I'll be gone. But if you do like the content you hear today, I would highly recommend and appreciate if you check out my solo videos on Roundtable Decision, as well as the new videos that will be published when I am gone on the trip. Now that we're kind of all caught up here to go, I will talk about our first metric here. So obviously, coronavirus has been all around us and something we are inundated with from news coverage. So I decided I would start off today's podcast with talking about COVID, just for the main factor of wanting to start and get it over with, if you want to use that as terminology. So I pulled up this outbreak.my, and I know that other podcasters and such were using different websites for this metric, but it all kind of serves the same purpose. So I thought I would go ahead and use this one here just to kind of show the case numbers compared to everybody else. So right now it says that the United States has 3,619,663 confirmed cases with 140,200 deaths and recovered of 1,646,698. Whew, I'm having trouble with numbers already. And then in treatment is another metric. But essentially the main rates we're looking at are the fatality rate and the recovery rate when it comes to an epidemic. Because those are the two major numbers that we're able to look at and tell exactly what is happening with our government and other things, or with the epidemic as itself, on if the case is actually the way it should be. And the fatality rate, according to this website and the numbers they have, is 3.87%. And the recovery rate is 45.49%. And those are two, as I just said, very solid metrics that you always want to look at when it comes to these metrics and how you view an epidemic and how severe it might be. If we all remember at the start of coronavirus, we were all worried that this fatality rate could be very substantial and huge. And at that time, the numbers were around, I believe, 1 or 2% for the fatality rate or death rate of this virus. And obviously, it's very easy to tell that any deaths of this virus are something that you should be concerned with, and it is something to take into account. I don't want to devalue anybody who has died or is seriously ill from coronavirus. I think that doesn't even really need to be said to be understood, but I still feel like it does need to be said because of the way politics is and things relating to politics. So, as I said, the main two rates are the fatality rate and recovery rate. So the fatality rate is something that measures the virus deadliness, obviously, as it's the death rate. And at 3.87%, just offhand, doesn't really seem like something that is huge and something that wipes out the entire planet, as you might see on a fantasy series through a novel or maybe through a movie. But it is something that is a lot higher than it was previously. But as I see from Ron, and hello Ron, good morning, he says the case numbers are inflated. The tests are inaccurate. Tyranny reigns supreme over a damn virus. SMH. And that is something I briefly wanted to talk about. Now, obviously, through this podcast and through my YouTube channel, I do want to try to stay as fair as possible to both sides. Obviously, I have my own bias, and I do lean towards one direction. And the direction I do think I lean towards is the valuable direction, in the direction that I think is more correct than the other. But at the same time, I do want to consider what the other side has to say, because it is very important to understand both. And most often, as I've always said, is the middle is most often right. So whatever the middle of CNN and Fox is from a news story is probably what's the most accurate, but doesn't always have to be that case, especially with fake news and other things relating to it. Although Trump made fake news very popular stance in the culture today, but at the same time, we all understand what fake news is, and he may have popularized the term or popularized the idea of it, but I do think a lot of media companies have given their bias fully through these most recent events with coronavirus and other things, especially against Trump, and coverage that is outright blatantly false for Trump. And I'm not a full Trump fan either. I don't want that to be misconstrued. I do think Trump has many flaws, but that's not really what we're talking about here. As Ron was saying, there's a big surge of case numbers and testing, but the testing isn't exactly something that I think is fully trustable and trustworthy. There was a story that Matt Christensen said on his channel, and I don't know if it's been fully proven yet, but it does seem to make some sort of sense. So I don't think that you should take it for 100% true, but at the same time, it is something that should be considered. And essentially, the story goes like this. The guy showed up at a testing center, the line was long, and had to go somewhere else. So he didn't actually get tested, although he was scheduled to. But the testing center came out and said that he was positive with coronavirus, although that was absolutely impossible because he never actually got tested. He may have had coronavirus, but we don't know that because he never actually physically got tested for it. And this isn't the only account of something similar that has happened through Twitter or through articles that you'll sometimes read about coronavirus. And it is something that we need to consider and something that should be looked at in a little closer detail. And that is something I've always kind of been considering within the coverage of this coronavirus case, because it is important that the numbers that are being used are valid and numbers that are true, because that gives us the full perspective of the virus. If there is any fudging of numbers or anything that isn't 100% true, the numbers then get inflated and become untrue. And it's something that needs to be held at a higher value, because real numbers show us the impact of the virus instead of fake numbers. Fake numbers might show an impact that you want to see in your agenda you want to show, but it doesn't really give a full perspective of the actual impact of the virus. And that kind of brings me to the main topic and why I decided to give the title of the video the way I gave the title of the video. And it's something that I've kind of been thinking about over the past couple days, especially when I was looking at podcasts such as the Matt Christensen Show and other podcasts I've mentioned on my YouTube channel, and shows I kind of regularly watch. And that is essentially, how much control are we willing to give to government? Right now, we have a battle between our government and the safety of how government treats us. So in other words, we are giving a lot of control to the government to allow us to be safe. And it's something that is very important, because safety is something we should value as a culture. But at the same time, are we giving up too much of our control and our freedom for safety? In other words, how willing are we to let the government completely make laws around us to take away our freedom just because of safety? Safety is very important, but at the same time, safety is something that is hard to ultimately judge, especially if numbers are getting manufactured and aren't 100% true. And that's why looking at these numbers and making sure that cases aren't inflated are very important, because it gives us the true perspective of the virus. And government is more than willing to step in to allow for more people to be safe. And ultimately, I think that's the biggest debate within coronavirus so far. As you know, or as if you watched episodes, but anyway, as I work in a grocery store, and this grocery store has made us wear masks as employees for a good probably month and a half, maybe 2 months. For that we've had to wear a mask in order to work at the store and be a cashier, bagger, or any other service you might have within the grocery store. And we also have borders, or I call them borders, but basically plexiglass in front of the cashier and in the bagging area where the bagger bags the groceries, obviously. And these safety precautions might make the employees feel safer. And I know that some people actually do feel safer having these walls and having masks, as it allows them to be more safer when they come home to their parents or visit older ones within that store. But it's also very concerning that the grocery chain, and now Walmart, as I'm about to read, and Kroger in this article, are now making it mandatory that people wear masks. So that brings me to my question and how I titled today's video, as I was just discussing: how much control are we willing to let the government have in keeping us safe? Are mandatory masks something that is 100% needed for our safety, or is it something that is suggested / required at some grocery chains just for the slim chance that it's more safe than not wearing a mask? And you could argue that it doesn't really affect anybody by wearing a mask. Just because you wear a mask doesn't mean you have to do anything else. In other words, putting on a mask and shopping isn't really that much of an effort compared to just shopping by itself and not wearing the mask. And that is something that is a interesting point. And I've seen a lot of people talk about it, especially some of the customers I have at the grocery chain that I work at. And essentially, you have your mix of customers, especially since I live in Texas. You have your more very conservative, MAGA supporting, Trump supporter, blah, blah, blah. You have those type of stereotype crowd within Texas, or the true cowboy stereotype. And then you have the more of the other side, or this, I don't know what you would call the stereotype, but they're not necessarily Karens, but they're people that have essentially told me, isn't everybody wearing a mask before it was mandatory to wear a mask for customers and employees? But at the same time, I guess in general what I'm trying to say is you have your people, your customers that are wondering why everyone isn't wearing a mask, are happy that everyone is wearing a mask, because it's simply just not that much effort to wear a mask and shop in public or whatever else you might want to do. But then you have your customers that are very annoyed that they have to wear a mask when they become shopping. And I have seen some troll type of efforts within shopping at the grocery store. And I'll talk about one of those briefly before I read some of the comments here from Ron and dive into today's article. But I kind of wanted to give my main perspective on it first. But one of the big troll efforts that I've seen was, if you watch the movie The Purge or any of the Purges, you would recognize kind of the mask structure that the Purge victims, or the Purge hunting, wore when they were searching for their prey in the movie. And if you watch the movie, you know what the prey was. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. It was a very scary looking flat mask, I guess would be a good way to describe it. And they had a customer walking around with that type of mask and shopping and just kind of staring at people. And I do think that it was a troll effort, and I did find it kind of funny. But you also have your masks that are kind of funny more towards like a stereotype of, if they have to wear a mask, where they're going to make it a funny mask, such as the Bane Batman mask that I've seen a couple of times. And I've also seen masks with writing, such as, fuck mask, or whatever they have on their masks, such for a stance about if they have to wear a mask, they're going to wear a mask that they want to wear. But before I read into this article, I thought I would read some of Ron's comments as I see here, because I do think they are very important and a stance that I do think a lot of customers I've seen have talked about. And Ron says, I already read that. Time to boycott and shut everything down. Demand that politicians stop taking prey while they destroy our lives and liberties. Unless you have a health condition that makes wearing the mask a problem for your health. And the HIPAA law protects people's privacy and their medical conditions. This mask mandate destroys that. If masks work, then wear one. Don't worry about whether someone else has one or not. The only problem would be someone who goes into a store coughing and sneezing, something that I would not do. I stay at home when sick. And that's kind of the main perspective, especially that last point about staying at home when you're sick. At the store I work at, there's a broadcast that gets played probably once every 5 minutes, or at least 5 minutes that I hear it. It's probably more often than that, but it's basically like, with your help, when you sanitize at the door, or blah, 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 you will help reduce the spread of COVID-19, blah, 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 blah. If you feel sick, or if you're coughing, or if you're sneezing, or whatever it says, please stay at home. And that's kind of the ongoing announcement. And this announcement's effort is to make sure that people who do feel somewhat sick or are sick do stay at home, because it's very important that healthy people shop and not sick people, especially in the time of an epidemic, even if you don't think the epidemic is as big as the media makes it out to be, as I do think some people have the perspective as. But also, Ron was talking about the HIPAA violation, about essentially the store can't require 100% that you wear a mask. And I know that the store chain I work at has gone through this problem, and I have air quotes around that, of people who say that they have a health condition that allows them not to wear a mask. I guess in short, HIPAA's law and the store and how they have to dodge around it is you can't ask the person if they do have this health condition, such as asthma, that they're allowed not to wear a mask. So because of that, you can't require that everyone to wear a mask, especially with that side note. And I do know that some customers know that law and know that advantage, and have used it to not wear a mask while shopping. And I'll continue on to this article here by CNN. Walmart will require customers at all of its U.S. stores to wear masks beginning next week, becoming the largest retailer to mandate facial coverings as coronavirus cases continue to rise. Other national chains made similar moves on Wednesday. Kroger and Kohl's announced that they would start requiring all customers to wear masks, signaling that more retailers are lining up behind mask-wearing mandates. The National Retail Federation, the main lobbying group for the industry, also called on retailers to require masks for customers. Most recent retailers and grocers instantly hesitated to enact their own mask mandates for customers during the pandemic, partially over fears of antagonizing shoppers who refuse to wear them. Retailers have said that they are reluctant to put their employees in the position of enforcing mask mandates. But the ground in the retail has shifted in recent weeks. As the coronavirus pandemic worsens, more than 3.3 million people have tested positive for the coronavirus nationwide, and more than 130,000 have died. Cases are climbing in much more of the country, and many cities and states are reposing restrictions to contain new outbreaks, including mask mandates in public settings. About 65% of Walmart's more than 5,000 stores, including its Sam Club locations, are located in areas where the government mandates are on face coverings. To help bring consistency across the stores and clubs, we will require all shoppers to wear face coverings starting Monday, July 20th. Walmart U.S. Chief Operating Officer Jacana Smith and Sam's Club Chief Operating Officer Lance De La Rosa said in a blog post Wednesday. They will give us time to inform customers and member of the changes, post signage, and train associates on the new protocols. Industry groups and unions have stepped up their calls around mask mandates for customers. In recent days, last week, the Retail Leader Industry Association, an industry trade group, called on the nation governors to pass statewide mandates requiring citizens to wear masks in public. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union also argued government officials and business leaders to require masks for customers in an advertisement over the weekend. Walmart's decision may impact other companies' policies around masks and the public views on wearing masks, said Alan Eastertren, professor at the Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas. Walmart has a great idea of influence in this regard, he said. It may signal to the public that if a large retailer like Walmart supports requiring customers to wear masks, it is good for Americans to do so more broadly as well. And that was kind of the main point I wanted to stop at with this article, because it is important to realize that major chains are now starting to mandate that customers have to wear masks through their store / requiring. And as we just mentioned with the HIPAA laws, some customers are choosing to use that as their advantage and not have to wear a mask because they can't simply be asked to 100% wear a mask. But there are instances of people who choose not to wear a mask get confronted through video or other circumstances of people who feel that they need to tell that person that they need to wear a mask. And then you have your occasional video that goes viral when that person decides to fight back. But I would say in general, as human society does, the average person is simply going to put on the mask and go with whatever Walmart or whatever their local community decides to go with. And if that is wearing a mask, then they will wear a mask and go with that. And that's something that is important to understand from there. And then Ron says, and that is why the mask will not work. All it takes is one sick person to go into the store with a mask and still spread the virus. Yeah, that's the thing. It's very hard to fully control something like a epidemic such as coronavirus that has a high spread, and you probably have had it, even if it's just asymptomatically, if you didn't have any symptoms through your blood type or whatever else it might be. And it's something that it seems to be on the strand of COVID how impactful it is, even though we don't know too much about exactly what strands there are from COVID. But as Ron was saying, essentially all it takes is one person not to follow the guideline and be sick, or follow the guideline and be sick, to spread this virus. So the point of masks aren't really 100% reliable, but at the same time, I think that stores are doing it to give a sense of security to the customers. And I think for some customers, this sense of security makes them think that they are 100% safe through going into the store and wearing a mask. Although science and another perspective of people like Ron and others might believe that simply one person being sick and having to wear a mask isn't helping anybody, as all it takes is one person, so why even do it? And I'm not saying that that's Ron's stance 100%, but it is a stance that I know a lot of people have. And then Ron says here, it is all security theater. We don't do this for influenza. And that is kind of another major point within the coronavirus debate. And some people who lean more towards conspiracy theories might think that the title that I have for the video of government control is why they are doing and requiring masks to be worn on counties and businesses. Because simply if you make everyone think that by wearing the mask you are 100% safe, then you create a sense of security for all those people, and a sense of security and government reliance, as in you have to rely on the government to be safe through wearing the mask and requiring everyone else to wear a mask because it is the government telling you to do so. It's very important to realize that there simply might just be a control factor with making people wear masks. And I'm not saying that that's 100% the case, but I do think that the conspiracy theory does have some reliability to it, because at the start, the WHO and other organizations said that masks didn't have to be worn, but later said that they did have to be worn, and there seemed to be another sort of undertone reliance or undertone meaning to why all of a sudden they decided to switch opinions, because the science for masks were already out there, and there were many data research databases and even articles you could read on Google Scholar about peer-reviewed yourself that give you the statistics on how reliable masks actually are. But I'll have a quick drink break before we get into this next one. Okay, this article is by NBC News. Tokyo reports record rise in new coronavirus cases as plans for Olympics scrutinized. Tokyo, a record 286 new coronavirus cases were reported by the city government in Tokyo Thursday, the highest number of new cases recorded in one day in Japan capital since COVID-19 pandemic began. As a result, the city government raised its coronavirus alert to red, the highest of 4 levels, late Wednesday among fears of a second wave of infections. The previous daily high was 243 cases, recorded on July 10th. Tokyo governor decided the situation as rather severe. She also argued the Japanese government to reconsider the timing for its go-to campaign to boost domestic tourism due to launch next week, pleading with people not to travel outside of Tokyo unless necessary. Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihisa Sugio said Wednesday 80% of the new cases in Tokyo are people under the age of 39 years old. I understand it's not leading to the collapse of the medical system. In total, Sugio added, in total 8,354 coronavirus cases have been recorded in the capital as of Wednesday. According to the local government, of those 721 were hospitalized and 8 are seriously ill. Emergency measures to stop the virus were lifted in May as infections fell in Japan, but people are still being asked to wear face masks in public, maintain social distancing, wash their hands, and avoid congested places without proper ventilation. Japan has managed to largely weather the outbreak with 22,890 record cases and 985 deaths to date, a figure considerably lower than many countries in Europe. More than 13.5 million cases have been confirmed worldwide, with the virus claiming more than 580,000 lives, according to the data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. News of the record arrived a day after the International Olympics Committee, IOC, said it did not want next year's Olympic Games in Tokyo to take place behind closed doors. IOC President Thomas Bach said that they are working on multiple scenarios based on advice of the World Health Organization. The Tokyo Olympics were supposed to take place this summer, but were postponed until 2021 because of the pandemic. The organization committee is expected to provide an update on how the games were transitioned to the new date on Friday. If the vaccine is not found until next summer, the IOC may have to once again consider postponing or completely canceling the Tokyo Olympics. So I kind of wanted to briefly mention that, not so much for the Olympics side, although I did find it somewhat interesting that they're relying on the evidence of WHO and other organizations to give them data and reliability to our steps to what they should do next. Because depending on how you view WHO gives you a perspective on exactly why it is. But I wanted to mainly give this example of an article to show that it's not just a U.S. thing, although I think that a lot of people already know that. And before I get into the next topic, I thought I would read Ron's comment, as I do think it is a good one for this transition. As he says, one would have to wear a hazmat suit to have effective prevention of contamination. And that is kind of why nurses in other fields that directly involve coronavirus treatment or deal with coronavirus patients in that manner do have to wear protective gear or protective suiting there to aid their patients. And that it's something that I know a lot of people have kind of talked about. And I know some whose his wife is involved in nursing and hospital and is directly involved with treating coronavirus patients or sick patients in general. And they have to go through several lines of masks. I think they have to wear even a mask over a mask to make sure that they can reuse the MP or whatever it's called, the protective medical mask. And they have a basic mask that can be washed over the top. But that's not really the main point. The main point is that they're wearing protective gear to be in interaction with the patient. And you could say that that is because they know this patient is sick and could potentially have coronavirus or has been tested and has coronavirus. But at the same time, these precautions are there for a reason. And if you come across that person and not have that hazmat suit or that much protective gear, and that person may not even know they have it with coronavirus, then that action of a mask or other stances simply does nothing to let you not be affected. But at the same time, wearing the mask is reassuring to a lot of people. But I thought I would talk about this article here because I found it rather interesting. I have talked about how the FDA goes about testing when writing an article for psychology class for my college. And it was very important that to write this article and understand how drugs were made, because simply the psychology teacher was just trying to show people that these drugs and side effects and things relating to mental health drugs such as antidepressants and other things have to go through several lines of testing. And these testing and through the FDA, it takes many years, like 3 to 5 years, or maybe even more than 3 to 5 years, but 3 to 5 years minimum for a drug or a shot or anything relating to human consumption through medicine to go through the stages of becoming a FDA-approved substance to be used. And that's something that does need to be think about and talked about from that perspective. And that brings me to this article here. Scientists call for volunteers to be infected with coronavirus to test vaccines. Over 100 prominent scientists, including 15 Nobel laureates, are calling for healthy volunteers to be exposed to the coronavirus to see whether vaccines against COVID-19 actually work. The scientists signed an open letter to Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health, NIH, in the U.S. on Wednesday, calling for human challenge trials and that they would greatly accelerate the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. Well, that kind of brings me to a point. As I was just kind of saying, it takes many years and many steps and many trials through a gradual setup to understand the vaccine and its impact fully. And through understanding this vaccine and its impact fully gives us the main perspective of how to approach it and how the FDA decides to approach the drug and therefore approve the drug. So that's why getting this vaccine in COVID-19 is going to take a very long time, even if you use your resources as much as you can to increase the speed on which this vaccine or which this drug might get approved. It is still going to take a very long time, and that's why this article I thought was rather interesting, but I'll continue on. Challenge trials see healthy volunteers deliberately exposed to a virus after being given a vaccine to test whether the vaccine works to prevent infection. Such trials are not without controversy, but organization One Day Sooner and other prominent experts incite the benefit of fast-tracking trials outweighs the risk and are calling on the U.S. government to authorize them. If a challenge trial can safely and effectively speed the vaccine development process, then there is a formidable presumption in favor of their use, which will require a very compelling ethical justification to overcome. To the letter published by One Day Sooner, an organization that advocates for challenge trials, states, scientists that signed the letter, including the director of the University of Oxford COVID-19 vaccine program, said that human challenge trials can provide information much faster than conventionally efficacy trials, which take months longer. In such trials, volunteers still receive the vaccine candidate or control. Instead of resuming life as usual and waiting to catch a virus, volunteers are deliberately exposed to the pathogen under a controlled conditions beyond being faster than conventional trials. A challenge test is likelier to conclude with interruptible results should the presence of the virus around the study site begin to fade over time, they added. The signatories of the letter came from a range of disciplines, including epidemiology, medicine, economics, and philosophy. They argue that the COVID-19 pandemic must be fought urgently on many fronts, but it is hard to picture robust economic and social recoveries in the absence of a vaccine. We are writing to underscore the vast importance of human challenge trials as a method to help develop vaccines. The letter notes that the U.S. lawmakers are already supporting the move. In April, 35 members of the House Representatives called on the U.S. regulators to consider allowing volunteers to be infected with the coronavirus to speed up vaccine testing. Over 100 vaccine candidates are already under development around the world, and there are 23 candidates in vaccines in a clinical evaluation stage, according to the World Health Organization. There appears to be a cautious acceptance that challenge trials could play a part in fast-tracking the development of a coronavirus vaccine. For his part, the NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins, has said that challenge trials are on the table for discussion, not on the table to start discussing a plan. The letter was also signed by more than 2,000 challenge volunteers organized by One Day Sooner, laying out the principles for an effective human challenge trial. The experts say crucial protections must be extended to protect the health and anatomy of its volunteers. So, the idea of a challenge trial through direct human testing is a rather interesting idea and something that I think is rather, if works, could be more effective towards the FDA or towards this drug simply getting approved more faster than not. And I'll read Ron's comments here. The vaccines will not work and will potentially kill people. There are too many variables of this virus now. And that's kind of the big thing. And I would like that Ron brought that up, because when I first read this article and I didn't understand the process of FDA and how it takes to get a drug approved and a shot approved, although I don't know a whole lot about it, but at that point, I don't think it's really 100% necessary to know every single detail about how it gets approved. I have a basic understanding, and through my basic understanding, I feel that through the process of trying to accelerate something is an idea that is something that should be considered, but at the same time, you are risking too much. This virus is a very potent virus towards a certain people, and at this point, we don't know exactly what this virus is 100% doing. In other words, you can have a perfectly healthy individual under the age of 35, and you can have an older individual with a pre-existing health condition, and they both get coronavirus, but the patient who is under 35 ends up dying, and the patient who already had an underlying health condition and is older ends up surviving with the virus and doesn't even have to get on ventilators. This has happened through a local story and a local person I know that is treating with coronavirus patients directly. And it's something that is very interesting to kind of understand. And I don't think that we know enough about coronavirus or enough about the science behind what coronavirus strands do or anything relating to that to understand fully about these testing. So I think the effort of trying to accelerate a coronavirus vaccine through the effort of human trials directly is something I don't know if 100% should be true, because a lot of times these testing centers will use animals such as lab rats and others to test this vaccine or to test this drug or to test this cosmetic or whatever it might be to make sure that it's not harmful before they end up going to humans. And although this vaccine that they're talking about may have already gone through that stage of animal testing, and animal testing does have its own limitations with PETA, and I know many people are not for harming of animals, but at the same time, one of the more one of the more debating issues from that is, would you rather test it through humans directly, or would you rather test it through an animal, then go to a human to make sure that it is fully safe for a human before it gets tested? And doing human trials is something that could be rather dangerous if it were to go wrong. And that brings me to this next one, and I thought I would include this article from CNN Business again. I have a lot of articles from CNN today, but before I dive into the article, I don't know if I mentioned it yet, so I'm going to mention it now. But all of these articles are in the description of my YouTube channel or on the description of the podcast from when you listen to it podcast on Apple, Spotify, or whatever else you might listen to the podcast from. You can, and I have all the articles labeled through the topic, and you can follow along with me now if you're watching now, or if you found any of the articles more interesting and wanted to look into it for yourself, that's where you can find them. But I'll continue on with this, and this isn't directly related to coronavirus 100%, but I did find it somewhat interesting and maybe somewhat funny as well. New poll reaffirms that most Americans don't trust the president. That's Donald Trump, if you didn't know. But they do trust Dr. Fauci, or as I call him, Dr. Liar. Okay, here we go. The New York CNN Business, I understand why American often feels like a 50-50 country, hopefully split right down the middle in some ways. But right now, on the key issue of trust, as the United States breaks the worst kind of COVID-19 records, we are not split in the half. It's more like 2 against 1. New polling from the Quinnipiac University found that only 30% of Americans registered voters say that they trust information that President Trump is providing about the coronavirus. To repeat, just 3 out of 10 voters trust what they say about the biggest crisis of his presidency. Controversially, 67% of registered voters do not trust COVID-19 claims. That is in line with the numerous past polls that only show 1 in 3 Americans viewing Trump as honest and trustworthy. Honest and trustworthy. I think that those numbers are fascinating because they indicate that a significant chunk of his supporter folks who say they approve of his performance do so even though they don't trust him. But I do think it's the next part of the Q poll is even more important. Nearly 2/3 of voters, 65%, say that they trust the information Dr. Anthony Fauci is providing about the coronavirus. The university said only 26% said they don't trust Fauci. There's clearly a gulf between the minority that trusts Trump and the majority that trusts Fauci. QPEC also found that 61% trust what the CDC says about the virus. Polling analyst Tim Moley said he may be out of the loop and disfavor with the White House, but it's clear from the numbers voters would like Dr. Fauci back on the call. I thought I would quickly kind of talk about those numbers and what the article's written so far before I go into a little bit more about the article and go back to the comment sections of this podcast. But I wanted to quickly mention my quick thoughts about it. So obviously, the president is someone that you want to trust and somebody that should be trusted as he is the spokesperson of your country. But at the same time, Dr. Anthony Fauci is somebody that should be trusted within this epidemic as it is ultimately his job. So the fact that only 67% of the people trust Fauci, I think is the more shocking number to myself when I first read this article. Obviously, we don't know everything about the coronavirus, and that's something that is clearly stated if you watch any sort of media coverage, if you get past all the fear involving the coverage itself. And the president also, again, should be someone that is trusted within the coronavirus news. But at the same time, I do think it should be said that Trump's coverage of anything he says does get blown out of proportion. And some of the stuff he does says is 100% true to get blown out of proportion. And what I mean by that is a lot of stuff what Trump says is controversial and something that really shouldn't be said. And as I said on my previous podcast, that is ultimately his bullish factor that I think allowed him to become president, as a lot of people were angry with the media and with the average politician that has come before Trump, and Trump used his bullish factor to become president. But at the same time, this bullish factor and what he says on his mind gets eaten up by mass media companies that go against him. And it is something that Trump, in a large part, falls into. But at the same time, a lot of these media articles decide to go against Trump no matter what he says, even on information that is true or has truth behind it. And it is something that is rather aggravating, and especially with coronavirus. It is something that shouldn't become political, yet has become political in almost every way. And the negative coverage of CNN and other mass media coverages on everything that Trump says is something that is worrisome. Constructive feedback and constructive criticism is something that should be valued, and is something that CNN and other media coverages that go against Trump should use. But they aren't doing constructive criticism. They're just attacking Trump on everything he says just for the effort and just for the clicks. And I do think that it is rather concerning, and that could lead to the numbers that Trump is getting for trust. Because at this time of the pandemic, no matter what political party you're in, I do think that you should be trying to understand this virus just as much as the president might be. And if the president does say something that is outright false, you should come out on your site, if you're such a big business as CNN or others are, and say it. And the same goes with Fox News. Fox News shouldn't just be 100% supporting Trump either. I don't think that they necessarily are. Fox News has kind of slipped more and more the opposite direction than core conservative media coverage. But you kind of get what I'm saying. I'm using CNN as an example because that's the article I have here. But I do think that every mass media company does fall into this trap. And then I'll read Ron's comment here. No, I don't trust Fauci. He already stating that wearing mask is symbolic, so the masks don't work, and he knows it. Fear porn, the media is driving the fear frenzy with their misleading reporting on the virus. And that's kind of the big thing that I was talking about. And I think Ron summed it up real nicely. And that is simply the fear and trying to rely on clicks. It is something that every mass media site does. Fox, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, blah, 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 blah. Name a site, they do it, especially if it's a mainstream mass media site. And mainstream and mass media are kind of the same thing, but you get what I'm saying. They're all reliant on clicks and ads from companies that want to support their media, or simply they're relying on clicks and their ad revenue to generate money for their company. And that's something that is very important. So the idea of making people constantly afraid of this virus that nobody understands is a way to drive up clicks, as everybody wants to learn something new about the virus and maybe understand it a little bit more, when in reality all you're doing is trying to stir up a little bit more tension from the virus. And I do think that every website, even Fox News and CNN and all of those, have done the fear porn, as Ron says, and as others have said, to drive up these numbers. But I'll continue reading this article a little bit more. Following the polling numbers and Wednesday's night breaking news, I'll skip that because I have another article in more detail about that. So we'll go over here. Fauci, I can't make a comment on that. During an interview at a viral summit hosted by The Atlantic, Dr. Fauci was asked, "There's been some reporting that the Trump administration has tried to cut back on your TV interviews. Isn't it important at the moment of the nation and the war to hear from you?" Fauci said. "I can't make a comment on that, but I think you know what the answer to that is. Yes, we all do the answer. The answer is yes." And then it goes on to talk when Fauci's next appointment of being on TV and addressing the media is. And I am not a big fan of Fauci, and I don't know if I could clearly state why I'm not a fan. But I guess if you want me to state it as simply as possible, I am not a fan of Dr. Anthony Fauci for the pure fact that I don't believe he has public interest 100% in his heart, but rather a certain motive that I don't know exactly what it is to be. But you could argue it's simply the control of masses through the idea of using coronavirus. And I don't know if that is something that is 100% truthful, as I've kind of already stated several times now, but there just is something off with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Alrighty. I thought I would give this article here as kind of a transition to the next topic. It didn't really fit in anywhere else, so I just put it in here. And as I said, I have a lot of articles from CNN, so this one is from CNN as well. UK, US, and Canada allege Russian cyber hacks on COVID-19 research centers. Russia's cyber actors are targeting organizations involved in the coronavirus vaccine development, according to a new warning by the US, UK, and Canadian security officials on Thursday that detail activity by a Russian hacking group called APT-29, which also goes by the name the Dukes or the Cozy Bear. An adversary published by the UK National Security Centre, NCSC, details activity by the Russian hacking group and explicitly calls out efforts to target the US, UK, and Canadian vaccine research and development organizations. APT-29's campaign of malicious activity is ongoing, predatory against the government diplomatic think tank, healthcare, and energy targets to steal valuable intellectuality and property, a press release on the adversary said. Cozy Bear is one of the two hacking groups linked in the Russian intelligence that is believed to have access to the Democratic National Committee international symptoms in the lead of 2016 U.S. election. What Thursday's announcement is the first time the group has been named in connection to the cyber attacks related to the coronavirus pandemic. The U.S., UK, and Canadian authorities have issued several warnings about state-backed cyber attacks against organizations involved in the coronavirus response in recent months. In April, CNN also reported an ongoing wave of cyber hacks on the U.S. government against agencies and medical institutions, leading to pandemic response by nation-states and criminal groups. Hospitals, research laboratories, healthcare providers, and permission companies have all been hit, officials said at the time. The Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has also stroked by a surge of daily strikes. An official with direct knowledge of the attacks previously told CNN, adding that Russia and China were the primary culprits. The National Security Agency, NSA, along with other partners, remains steadfast in its commitment to providing national security by collecting issues in this critical cybersecurity advisory as foreign actors continue to take advantage of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. NSA Cybersecurity Director Ann Derberg said in a statement Thursday, APT-29 has a long history of targeting government, diplomatic, think tank, healthcare, and industry organizations for intelligence gain, so we can encourage everyone to take this threat seriously and apply the recommendations issued in the advisory, she said. And then we condemn these despicable acts against those doing vital work to combat the coronavirus pandemic. NSCS Director of Operations Paul Schister said in a statement, working with our allies, the NCSC is committed to protecting our most critical assets and our top priority at this time to protect the health sector. So, through that article, I'm not 100% true. I'm not 100% sure about what Russia, or if Russia is doing it, but what a hacking of the coronavirus vaccine would necessarily do. And I don't know if I'm 100% true, like I just said, on what the impact would be. But essentially, if they're trying to hack this information and then make it themselves, or hack this information and have an underlying method towards what might come in the future, I don't know if that's 100% true, but I thought I would still include it because it is funny that Russia is still being talked about in politics, even though it may not be directly related to Trump. It still was kind of funny, and I thought I would include it, even though I'm not entirely sure about why Russia might even want to, besides simply hacking the vaccine information or vaccine research to try to make a vaccine for their own citizens and information. And Ron says, CNN reports that Americans trust Fauci over Trump. CNN has a zero credibility. They have been caught lying or fabricating news. I decided that CNN was not trustworthy when they were broadcasting a shock and awe attack on Baghdad during the Gulf War Bunker 1. And that is something that CNN, New York Times, and even really Fox News, I don't really trust at this point very much at all. And that's something that is kind of very disheartening for me. Not that I necessarily trusted CNN in the first place, but these mass media sites are getting relied on so much, and it does make me a little bit saddened to kind of read articles and know that it's outright false when the true effort of a news company or mass media company should be trying to give perspectives of news that is truthful. And CNN has been caught outright lying, and they had a top journalist, or a journalist CNN gave a reward to, that was caught manufacturing lies for his stories and simply just making up information to make his stories more compelling and more insightful. And welcome Lazy ASF. And then he says, is being gay a sin? If I take fat, No, I'm not going to read that. And then Ron says, we don't need to entertain your sexual desires here. Get a grip. That is something that is that's why I'm not going to read it. Let's just put that there. I'll continue on. That's the privilege of live streaming, is occasionally you'll be caught probably reading something you're not supposed to. Anyway, I'll continue on. And this is my next category of news, and I'm going to be talking about Trump and polling with Trump, because a lot of polls he's become the second place or not the leader of, and that's something that is very interesting from relating into politics, although I don't 100% trust polls. But before I just blabber on, I'll read into this article. Trump has a 50% problem in a new NBC News poll Washington Street Journal poll. And this was by Chuck Todd. We all know about Chuck Todd. Anyway, one figure consciously stands out for the President Trump in our new national poll, 50%, and not in the good way form. 50% of all registered voters in our poll strongly disapprove of the president. 50% say there is no chance at all they will vote for him. 52% in a separate question say that they are very uncomfortable about his candidacy. 51% are backing Joe Biden in the horse race versus 40% for Trump. One of the top maxims of American policies used to be that incumbent for any office needs to be at 50% to be safe for re-election. Otherwise, there is a majority of voters who exist that don't support him or her. But Trump has a different problem at hand. He's got a 50% or more of the national electorate saying that they strongly oppose him. And that is something that a new campaign manager alone can't fix. By the way, it's remarkable that Trump has switched his chief or staff campaign manager in the election year, and that they are just bliss as stories. Meet the voters who are up for grabs. As mentioned above, our blah 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 poll, 50% of registered voters saying that there is no chance to vote for Trump. Add another 37% of voters saying that the same about Biden. That leaves 13% who are up for grabs, saying that there is slight chance that they might change their minds about either Trump or Biden. So there are 13% that have negative impressions of both Trump and Biden, but Biden's favorite/unfavorite with them is slightly worse, 11% positive, 45% negative, than Trump's 22% positive, 43% negative. They prefer Republicans in control of Congress by almost 2-1 margin. But their 2016 vote was split 4 different ways. 20% for them to vote Trump, 21% for Hillary Clinton, 21% voted for a third party, and 27% didn't vote. And that is the last thing that should give us pause about to give us pause about those up for grabs. Just 40% of them have high interest in 2020 elections versus 77% of all voters in our poll. And then, thank you, Ron, for the lemon, I believe it is. I'm still a little bit new to D-Live there, or Diamond. I'm not sure exactly what that one was, but. And Ed says, Wyatt, you should get the chat bot so all guests goes into the same place. I can show you how to work after. And then Ron says, good idea, Ed. Vote for Joe. Let your mind go. And I do actually have the chat bot, but I don't have it fully set up yet, as I've had some problems with Streamlabs through tests I've done a couple of times on private, in other words, and I've used a couple of different computers and channels and just to kind of test it before I went. But I'm having some problems with Streamlabs and getting the webcamera to show up and not just be a blank screen or a black screen. So once I kind of get that figured out, I'll be able to use the chat bot fully. But I actually do have it, and I think I have it set up right. But anyway, I'll talk to you after to make sure that I don't have something obviously wrong for the next podcast or for the next live stream I do. So that was the NBC polling, and as I was kind of saying, the main thing about polls is understanding where the poll comes from or where the information from the poll is based off of. In other words, what demographics are they taking in? A lot of polls tend to be weighted in some sort of direction, and that direction is very important to understand and to be based off of how and why that direction is there. In other words, if you poll more Republicans than you poll Democrats, then your poll is weighted towards a Republican direction, and therefore that needs to be taken into account. So looking at especially political polls, it's important to know what demographics they polled through party affiliation to understand how the poll is. And I don't know that on the data that is provided on this article, but I do know that several other polls have weighed more towards more Democratic, and therefore the margin of error or the margin should be weighted in that direction. And it's very important to know that based off of that. And thank you, Ron, for the one ice cream. And then Ron says, see, Ed is 10 times richer than I am. And then Ed says, just remember, Ron, I haven't put any currency into D-Live. I'm not donating my money. I'm donating yours. Anyway, and this is from 538. And those that followed politics on polling from last presidential election, you'll know that in general 538 was probably the most reliable or the most realistic polling from those researching efforts, or from the efforts of that last year's election. But I'll continue on here, as it says, why Trump, not Biden, might have an enthusiasm problem. The Trump campaign has found a silver lining in the avalanche of awful polling numbers. Voters who support Donald Trump are enthusiastic about his candidacy. Polls constantly show that Trump supporters are more excited to vote for him than presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden supporters are to vote for him. For example, half of Trump supporters in a recent USA Today Suffolk University poll said that they were very excited about their candidate compared to just 27% of Biden backers. Trump campaign manager Brad Barsky even described their enthusiasm advantage over Biden as the most important factor in the campaign. But the significance of this is the enthusiasm gap is exaggerated. Enthusiasm votes count just as much as unenthusiastic ones, meaning enthusiasm gap would only really matter in a close election, and right now it isn't a close election. Biden leads Trump in a national poll by nearly 9 points. No enthusiasm advantage, no matter how big, could possibly make up for that kind of gap. Let's pretend, though, that voter enthusiasm is an important metric for understanding Trump and Biden's candidacies. The Trump campaign would still have a problem, and that is because the 2020 enthusiasm gap is mostly a myth. First, while Biden voters may not be all that excited about voting for Biden, they are very enthusiastic about voting for Trump, and that gives Biden a pretty strong edge because Trump voter supporters don't despise Biden that way they despised Hillary Clinton in 2016. In fact, according to a survey data from the Democracy Fund by UCLA Nationscape Project, the shape of Trump voters who rate Biden unfavorably is constantly much lower than the share of Biden voters who vote Trump negatively. Nearly 30 percentage points lower as of the last survey conducted at the end of June. And that brings me to my first main point with this so far, and that is, last presidential election, it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And I know a lot of people didn't like either candidate, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And it was something that was very interesting to look at and to understand based off of that. In other words, many people didn't want to vote for either candidate, and I know a lot of people didn't vote, but there was also a lot of people who simply voted for Donald Trump because he was the best of two evils. Now it is Joe Biden versus Trump. And Trump obviously has had his enemies and has his people that are not going to vote for him no matter what. But if you take the normal person who voted for Trump instead of Hillary Clinton last election, I don't know if he's going to get as much people who are simply just going to vote for him because he is the less of two evils. Because Joe Biden is simply the average Joe of a candidate. He isn't necessarily going to do and say something that is 100% wrong for an average person. He is just the average Joe. He's kind of just Joe Biden. He's just there. And that's something that is interesting. And I do think that is somewhat concerning for Donald Trump in this election. I think you would be a little foolish to think that Trump is going to win outright on this election. As any election, there is many variables to take into account. Second, because Trump voters don't dislike Biden as much as Biden voters dislike Trump, Biden actually has an advantage in net enthusiasm, calculated as the difference between a candidate's very favorable and very unfavorable rating. The gap on the matrix has widened between the two in the past month. What is especially noticeable here is that Biden's net enthusiasm rating is near zero, which is similar to most major party presidential candidates' rating from 1980 to 2012. Trump's current score of around -20, on the other hand, has only one historical comparison other than his own campaign 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton 2016. Or Hillary Clinton in 2016. Trump should know better that this isn't good. After all, he won in 2016 in part because of the record number of voters who had negative opinions of both major candidates broke decisively in his favor. But right now, Trump can't count on the haters to swing the election for him again. Registered voters with negative opinions of both Trump and Biden preferred Biden to Trump by a whopping 23-point margin in the polling from Nationscape conducted in June. They also rated Biden less negatively overall, with only 33% of the group saying that they had a very unfavorable opinion of Biden, compared to 62% who said the same of Trump. And it goes on for a little bit more, so if you want to understand the enthusiasm problem, you can look at this 538 article as well. But that is something that is very important to look at, because polling in general, as I've said at the beginning of this episode, isn't something that should be taken into account and be 100% true, because it's important to look at the analytics and demographics behind each poll. But at the same time, polling can show in general the enthusiasm or level of interest a candidate might have. And Trump won in a good margin because Hillary Clinton was such an unfavorable candidate. And I don't know if Joe Biden necessarily has that as unfavorable account or unfavorable perspective as Hillary Clinton did have before. And Ron says, I voted for Johnson. He was confused about where Apollo was. Good. He had no plans for bombing anyhow. Yeah, I remember he had that one incident that kind of tanked his whole campaign or his whole effort towards being president. But as we all know, the Libertarian Party or other minor parties, but majorly the Libertarian Party, it's very hard to get a Libertarian candidate to very much votes in a presidential election or even a local election at that point. Third parties have to go up a very, very large hill to become a candidate in the United States political system compared to like UK or Australia, where there are several parties that get several votes and have several different parties for a government base. In other words, having 5 or 6 parties in the UK and having your people having several representatives of each party on each committee or whatever else isn't something that is something that is normal in the UK compared to the United States. Alrighty. Trump shakes up campaign leadership as he struggles in latest polls. President Donald Trump shook up his campaign leadership on Wednesday, announcing that he is promoting Bill Stephen to be his campaign manager and demoting Brad Parscale, who had been serving in that role. That announcement comes on the same day that 2 national polls show that President Trump towing in presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden by double digits. There may be more staffing changes to come at the campaign, but nothing significant is expected in the immediate future, an official tells CNN. The future of Parscale, who had been lauded by the president and his allies as a digital guru who helped secure Trump's first election ever and became his re-election campaign manager in early 2018, had been in serious doubts for weeks. In addition, for the president's lagging poll numbers, Trump was furious about a much-hyped return to the campaign trail fell flat at the end of June. A planned rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma fell well short of expectations after Parscale predicted massive crowds, not only inside the 19,000-seat arena, but also outside as well. In the weeks leading up to the event, Parscale predicted as many as 100,000 people would show up to support the president. Instead, a meager crowd of 6,000 came. The outdoor event was canceled and Trump was embarrassed. laying much of the blame on Pascal, who personally offered up Tulsa as one of the locations the president returned to the trail. Trump has repeatedly criticized Pascal in the meetings over the turnout. Pascal was unaware that he was being demoted until a few hours before on the Wednesday night announcement. A source familiar with the situation told CNN. But after a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Stephan on Tuesday, Trump's son-in-law and advisor, Jared Kushner, informed Pascal of the decision, according to a source familiar with the conversation. I am pleased to announce that Bill Stephan has been promoted to the role of the Trump campaign manager, Trump said in a Facebook post. Pascal has been with me for a very long time and has led tremendous digital and data strategies. Will remain in that role, while being a senior advisor to the campaign. Both were heavily involved in our historic 2016 win, and I look forward to having a big and very important second win together. This one should be a lot easier as our poll numbers are rising fast. The economic is getting better, vaccines and therapeutics will be soon on the way, and America wants safe streets and communities. A senior campaign advisor said, Trump, Vice President Mike Pence, and top advisors to both men have been discussing the Pascal move for a number of days. The advisor described the situation for Pascal as untenable. The Trump family had become annoyed in recent weeks at the reports of how much money Pascal was making in his role, including the stories about his own ownership of a Ferrari. Pascal, the advisor said, had been advised to lay low and stay out of the limelight, advice he apparently did not take. The advisor said Stephan, Jason Muir, and Jeff DeWitt are now viewed as running the day-to-day operations of the campaign. And then it goes on and on and on and on to talk about a little bit more details to why CNN thinks that Pascal was demoted. But it's rather interesting to give a perspective of the Tulsa rally, its numbers of the stadium. I remember on the last podcast that they mentioned the stadium and how it was filled. And as Ed said on his channel from his contemporary show every morning, I'll give that another shout out. What's also on freedomscoop.com. But anyway, he made a joke about why that statistic was even in there in the first place, because it didn't necessarily seem to be part of the article that it was talking about. And I think that Ron kind of sums up the main point I wanted to talk about, so I'll read his comment and then give my general thoughts on it as well. Firing his campaign manager shows just how clueless Trump is. The poll numbers are BS, and he should know that from the 2016 election. Then Ron says, using Tulsa as a marketer for how popular he is. Low, liberal, hellhole. And if I'm not mistaken, Ron does live in Tulsa, or sorry, not to live in Tulsa, but Ron does live in Oklahoma, so he knows a little bit more about the local Oklahoma politics than I do. But I do know that Tulsa is somewhat similar to Austin here in Texas, where it is kind of a liberal zone or a liberal hub of audience perspective on that. So the fact that he wasn't able to fill up a stadium isn't necessarily shocking, especially at the time of COVID-19. Even if you say that the supporters that are most likely to come to a Trump rally are people that don't necessarily agree with COVID-19 or think that COVID-19 is as big as a pandemic as it is. In other words, if you think that the average Trump supporter, and kind of use a stereotype, is a hillbilly country boy that doesn't care about this pandemic and is going to show up to his rally. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly where I wanted to go with that, but basically, if you think that even the average Trump supporter doesn't care about masks and is going to show up in a mass event just because of the fact that they want to support their president and somebody they fully agree with, it's rather silly to think that the pandemic has little effect over the rally, but more of a meaningful effect. And it's something that has had an effect everywhere and not just on certain political events, even if you think so. That is what I mentioned on my last podcast, where coronavirus doesn't care about what political party you're in. So it's going to exist there no matter what. And then Ron says, Tulsa, it just passed a mask mandate. And yeah, I thought Tulsa did that. I thought I remember hearing that. I know I live in a mask mandate as well. So it's something, I think the mandate's been there for like 2 weeks now, I believe. But anyway, I'll go on to this next article, as it says by Gracie Sparks and CNN again. Biden opens up a 15-point lead over Trump in new national poll. Former Vice President Joe Biden has opened up a 15-point lead over President Donald Trump, according to Quinnipiac University national poll. That also spells out bad news for the president on an economy, his most important selling point for re-election. A majority of registered voters, 52%, report that they will support Biden in the general election, with 37% going for Trump, a wider margin than a Quinnipiac June poll when 49% backed Biden and 41% supported Trump. An NBC/WSJ poll, the poll we mentioned earlier in today's podcast, out Wednesday also finds Biden leading Trump with an increasing margin. Biden with 51% support among registered voters over Trump's 40%. The poll also finds growing disapproval of Trump's job performance, with a notable shift on the economy where reviews of Trump's performance have turned negative. The economy has been the only issue. Trump's earned a net positive rating in the Quinnipiac polling, but now 44% approve while 53% disapprove of his performance. However, the NSBC WSJ poll didn't find the same reversal. A majority of registered voters, 54%, approve of how Trump is handling the economy in that poll. 42% disapprove, steady from their February poll. Overall, the survey finds 36% of registered voters approve of the way Trump is handling his job generally, and 60% disapprove, compared with 42% approve to 55% disapprove in June. The survey also finds Biden edging out Trump when voters are asked who would do a better job handling the economy. 50% say Biden and 45% say Trump, a reversal from June when 51% said Trump would do a better job to 46% Biden. Most registered voters, 61%, disapprove of the way Trump is handling the reopening of schools, while 29% approve of Trump's approval on the issue. It is about the same among parents of kids under the age of 18, 30%. The Quinnipiac poll shows the majority of voters, 62%, think it will be unsafe to send students to elementary, middle, and high schools in the fall. 31% believe it will be safe in May. 40% felt it would be safe to send students back to school. 40% felt it would be, around the same number. 34% thought it would be safe to send college students back in the fall. And I thought I would include, we heard a lot of those numbers in that last polling article I pulled up, but I wanted to quickly mention this one as well, especially for the last information about school, as that was one of the main episodes on my last week podcast. And basically the whole effort of that is taking whatever account on polls and reopening of schools, as that's the most recent news event, mainly to come out of how people might view Trump and his policies coming out of COVID-19. As we all know, the media likes to stir up chaos and stir up coverage of COVID-19. So through stirring up this coverage of COVID-19 and creating chaos, you might be fearful about how big of COVID-19 impact is. And through Biden simply talking about, through Trump simply talking about wanting to reopen schools, it's very important to understand that this talk needs to happen for schools to reopen in the first place. Because if they don't necessarily have that talk, it's hard to understand what would happen from there. And that says, what is the closest metro to you? If I'm not mistaken, you are quite a distance away from Seawall. Single poles are garbage. Aggressives arguments are the only thing that even remotely reliable, and even that's slipping. And those are both from Ed. And then Rod says, especially if the polls are taken by those with twisted motives. And I would argue that every poll is taken with a somewhat twisted motive or bias that they want to cover, even if you're approaching it from the most unbiased perspective possible. I just don't think that it's 100% reliable to have a poll be that way. And I'll answer Ed's question before we move on from this topic. The closest metro to me is the Houston metro. As the Houston metro. I'm decently close to the Houston metro system than anything else. I think that's what you're asking there, but yeah, that's the one I'm the most closest to. Nervously optimistic, and this is by The Guardian, by the way. Nervously optimistic. Democrats eye blue wave, but 2016 memories are fresh. Less than 4 months out from the November election, the Democratic president candidate Joe Biden has been consciously pulling ahead of Donald Trump. The president's approval members remain underwater, and Democrats believe that they can seriously compete in the traditional red states, including Texas, as Trump faces sustained criticism for his handling of coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis linked to it, as well as the ongoing anti-racism protest against police brutality. Before I move on this article, I want to quickly mention a article, or not really an article, but an idea I have been thinking about relating to coronavirus. So if you're a real big kind of conspiracy type of person, you might be thinking, well, why is coronavirus become such a big deal if you don't really necessarily believe in the numbers? And as I've titled the article, or as I named the podcast, government control is one of the main topics of what I'm considering with the virus. I'm not 100% believing in the conspiracy fully, but the main point of why I bring that up again is if you believe that coronavirus is getting pushed so much by mass media coverages and getting pushed in general, it could be a way to control people and make them think about coronavirus instead of Joe Biden. We all know that Joe Biden is somebody that isn't exactly well-spoken as he might have been, or he might have used to be. He's gotten older and he's gotten a little bit weird, even if he's always been weird, considering how you think of Joe Biden. But keeping them quiet is probably the best approach the DNC can do as far as policies and how Joe Biden might win. Because simply, if you want to think about the election and you think that Trump is outright wrong for his bullish factor and don't necessarily think of policies, but think that Trump could lose just because of the way he is, you could think that if they keep Joe Biden quiet and make people think that Trump is doing everything wrong with coronavirus, that Joe Biden could simply just win for the fact that Trump did everything wrong, or the public has thought that Trump has done everything wrong. So keeping Biden quiet, it may be the best approach to winning this election. And I think that there is some truth to that, because I don't know if Biden necessarily is the best at public speaking as he might have used to be. But I'll read Ron's question before I move on. Ed's question, or comment. I was asking you where in Texas you were without letting you dox yourself. Well, that's why I said near Houston. I don't want to give exact location, although I'm not necessarily fully afraid of it, but obviously I don't want to give my exact location for real obvious reasons. What did I press here? Nope, I want to go back. Okay, here we go. For Democrats, there are not only indicators that things are going well, infighting between the progressive wing of the party and the establishment wing have been relatively minimal as they come together to focus on Biden's campaign to push Trump out of the White House. Some top party officials are feeling ambitious and want to ride another potential blue wave to win races that are usually out of the reach in states like Georgia and Ohio. But there's a strain of caution running through the Democratic Party as well. Things looked great for them while in 2016 too, but Republicans ended up in control of the White House and both chambers of Congress, and the memory of the catastrophic loss is still fresh. I mean, we are emotionally and mentally scarred in such a way that we are not going to feel comfortable until a week after Biden is sworn in, said this Democratic strategist Tom Bowen. Have a coronavirus. No, I'm joking. In any election cycle, campaign officials use cautious phrases like "we are not leaving anything to chance" or campaigning like "we are 10 points down until the election day." And the 2020 presidential race is no different, but coupled with its argument that Trump's case for re-election is not reaching the voters he needs to. A recent Biden campaign surrogate's memo by his deputy campaign manager, Kate Benefield, said no matter how hard he tries, the only candidates Trump attacks harm are himself and down the ballot of Republicans who have handcuffed themselves to him. Simply put, the American people just aren't buying fabrications about Biden. The memo went to tick off the problems with each of Trump's arguments. On Tuesday, in another sign that Democrats were rare opening to compete what are usually Republican strongholds, the Biden campaign began airing a 60-second general election ad in Texas, fueled by a 6-figure ad buy. That ad is the first in 15 million multi-state blitz in 6 battlefield states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. And it's largely considered that if you win Florida, you'll win the election. But it isn't necessarily 100% truthful, but you get the point. Meanwhile, the pro-Trump America First Action Super PAC is pouring $24 million into Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, and Wisconsin, but not Michigan, a state that Trump needs to win re-election. Trump himself has been campaigning over the past few months in reliably red states. Private polling for Republicans also shows the president in trouble in what are usually reliable conservative states, all of which suggest that Democrats have the upper hand over Republicans. But Democrats, state officials, and operative expect polls to tighten and the summer high to end. In multiple interviews, those officials were hopeful but also realistic that the next few months won't be easy. Democrats often cite 2016, where polls showed Hillary Clinton as the clear favorite to win the presidency. At the time, and again now, some Democrats also felt retaking control of the Senate was possible. I'm not going to argue that there is some anxiety there, and I think that 2016 put it in our being because we are feeling very secure that we would have a Democratic president, and things change so rapidly, said the Kansas Democratic Party chairwoman Vicky Hattie. Democrats are hoping to win the U.S. Senate seat in Kansas, the cycle which would usually be unheard of. I think over the past 3.5 years, we have seen from some very unpredictable things that we would have never have expected. I think that it's where the anxiety comes from. For me personally, I'm not going to rest until we have this thing done. I am cautiously optimistic, but I am not taking anything for granted. And it goes on to talk about a little bit more quotes from Democratic leaders or Democratic politicians and such about their perspective on if they might win this election cycle compared to the last 2016 presidential election, as winning the Senate, the House, and obviously the presidency is a big deal. But I don't know if Democrats are necessarily viewing everything as they should be. I do think that coronavirus, if you take from a completely conspiratorial political angle, is a good way to have people focus on the negatives of Trump and maybe the Republican Party if you view Trump as the leader of the party, and to ignore everything else that has happened from a policy perspective. So it could be a good way to pull up that perspective. And Ron says, "Oh, things did not change rapidly in 2016. Hillary never had a chance. They had a lot of wishful thinking that quickly evaporated." That was the interesting thing with Hillary Clinton. It could have even been a different election with Bernie Sanders. I don't think that Bernie Sanders would have won either over Trump, but it would be a rather alternative universe that I would have been interested to see. And we're not going to be able to see it on this election cycle either, although a lot of Bernie fans thought that he got gypped once again, but he definitely got gypped in 2016. So a lot of his supporters did not like what happened, and a lot of Democrats even didn't like Hillary Clinton, and I would say the average person didn't like Hillary Clinton. I knew a lot of people that simply weren't going to vote because they didn't like either candidate, but I also knew a lot of people that were going to vote for Trump just because they hated Hillary Clinton so much. So I don't think that they were smart with going with Hillary Clinton at all in this election cycle or anything like that. But that brings me to my next main point, and that is about time that Joe Biden picks his vice president. Now, vice presidents don't exactly mean everything when it comes to an election cycle, as many people probably couldn't name the vice president of many presidents in the past. And even I don't think during the time of 2016 that people could name both Hillary Clinton and Trump's vice president. I think Trump's vice president now, Mike Pence, is a pretty popular name. But back then, I don't know if that was necessarily truly the case. So as I've said, vice presidents don't mean everything, but it's about the time that Joe Biden picks his vice president for the political party. And for the Democrats, after he wins the Democratic nominee and nomination. Obviously, there's not going to be too much of a chance that he doesn't win, but it's still coming up to get a full endorsement. But we all kind of know that Joe Biden is going to be that person to represent the Democrats. But I do think that whoever Joe Biden picks as his vice president is going to have a little bit more of a meeting this election cycle than in the past, because I do think that it can be seen as pandering, and you'll understand why when I get into the articles. And I'll take a quick drink and read Ron's comment real quick. Ron says, "Don't like her. I love that evil woman and her pedo husband." Yeah, there is no doubt that Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton are not necessarily people you should be trusting. And I do think that Democrats made a pretty big mistake with going with Hillary Clinton in that last election cycle. But it's past now, and we obviously have had President Trump as our leader for 3 and some months. As this PBS article talks about the first major candidate for vice president. I remember on Ed's Ward show, he would always ask who you thought Joe Biden might pick for his vice president. And it was kind of a reoccurring question that he would ask a lot of guests on his show. And I always was kind of thinking it would be one of two people, but mainly a woman as his vice president, because that kind of seemed to be a major theme. It seemed like whoever Joe Biden was going to pick on the early stages, it was going to be a woman vice president. It wasn't necessarily going to be a black woman or a woman of color as a vice president till a little bit later on. And that person of women of color started to become a theme after Joe Biden kind of stated that he was definitely going to have somebody of color on his vice president and be a vice president to him. And as I was saying, he would often ask that question on his show. And I would go with one or two people. I would either say it was Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris. And obviously now that we know that Joe Biden might be pandering or at least picking a woman of color, that would be very historic, despite, the First Lady, President Obama, being a woman of color. But you get the point of having a vice president of color. I thought the best option, and the option I thought of right away, was Kamala Harris. And this article talks about how that might help Joe Biden with Kamala Harris being his vice president. But it is also important to state, before I go into the article, that on the previous Democratic debates, Kamala Harris did have a couple of beefs with Joe Biden, most notably attacking his record and other ideas relating to him. So Kamala Harris might not be a 100% smart pick for Joe Biden when it comes to picking somebody that would represent him fully. But at the same time, whoever Joe Biden might pick, and even for the fact Trump might pick, due to presidency being such a harsh position and both men being at a higher age, it is important to realize that the vice president could also be the potential to take over the country. So whoever the vice president is, it does hold a significant impact. no matter which political party. As this article is from PBS by Daniel Bush, and it states how a VP with law enforcement experience could help Biden win over moderate votes. With race and policy now at the forefront of the 2020 election, some Democrats are making the case that former Vice President Joe Biden could benefit from picking a running mate who has experience working in the criminal justice system. The push has centered on Senator Kamala Harris of California and Representative Val Demings of Florida, the only two candidates on Biden's reported short list who have law enforcement experience. Real quick, I'll take a break. Just before we dive into this, Kamala Harris did get attacked on her record. I believe it was by Buttigieg, I think, was going after her on her record about, I think, drugs, it was, or something relating to her prosecution and lying the facts. But basically, long story short, she got her record of her past and prosecutor history under attack by, again, I think it was Pete Buttigieg. And at that time, it was very interesting and one of the biggest downfalls to Kamala Harris's campaign as a whole. And I remember reading articles after the fact where the things Pete Buttigieg was talking about with her record were true, and it did have a very big scar within Kamala Harris's record of law enforcement. But I'll continue on. Harris's time as a prosecutor and state attorney general was a liability during her failed White House bid last year, hurting her with younger, more progressive voters. And under the national spotlight, Demings is facing fresh scrutiny for her stint at Orlando's first female police chief. If Biden chooses Val Demings or Kamala Harris, he's clearly going to receive criticism for those progressives leading the nationwide protest over racial injustice, said Ron Lester as a Democratic strategist. Still, several Democratic lawmakers, law enforcement officials, and others say having a running mate with law enforcement background could help Biden win over some moderate voters he needs to beat Donald Trump. Unlike many younger progressive activists, older, more moderate Democrats along them with older black voters are typically more inclined to see having a law enforcement background as a positive, Lester said. And he said that they are much more likely to vote than the young people talking about the defund the police. And I see from the comment section here on DLive that Ed was saying it was Coconut Mommy or Tosi. And I do remember that now that you said that. But either way, Kamala Harris's record was attacked in something that is very important to understand, because I don't know if she would be a clear candidate based on just her law enforcement or her criminal justice history. But I'll continue on here. Harris and Demings know the system and can speak to it in a way that has some depth, said Nick Ackerman, a former federal prosecutor. Both would bring instant authority to any conversation about criminal justice issues, Ackerman and others argued. Someone who was calling for structural change in the criminal system, who was also part of it, speaks with some credibility. Others argued that while Harris and Demings have both been out of law enforcement for years, their commitment to structural change and policing would always be questioned given their time spent working within a system that does not embrace reform. Harris' tenure as an elected prosecutor and attorney general put her in very difficult spots to push reform, said William Yeomans, an attorney in the Department of Justice from 1981 to 2005. I was going to say that would be a very, very long time if it was the other way around. But it talks a little more in depth about why it might help, but I thought I would quickly mention that. And obviously, if you're interested in that angle, it is a very in-depth article about the Democratic perspective of Kamala Harris or the other getting in as VP to Biden, but it wasn't necessarily a full topic I wanted to discuss. But I'll go on and read Ron Helton's comment here. I don't think most black Democrats will vote for Kamala. She was a big enforcer of the drug war, which affected blacks the most. Asked if she smoked pot while putting others in prison, she laughed. And then Ed's comment about Tulsi being the one. And then Ron says Biden would have a better chance with Tulsi. I would vote for the hypocrite. And I do think that Tulsi as a vice president would be something that would get a lot of upvotes towards a lot of general people. Because I do think that Tulsi would general people, especially people that believe that America should get out of wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, anywhere else we've been and don't get in any wars currently or in the future. Tulsi would be a good candidate based just on that because she is a stronghold and that's one of her biggest stance. But Ron made it clear that he said will not vote for her. But then again, I do think that you're a person who's a little bit different than the average person, obviously, Ron. But I do think it's funny that I misread that in the first place. But anyway, I do think that Tulsi could be an interesting pick for Biden. But that's obviously not the route that Biden seems to be going with vice president. As from Bustle.com, it says 12 expert predictions for Joe Biden's vice president pick. When President Obama asked Joe Biden to be his running mate in 2008, Biden was sitting in a dentist's office where his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, was having a root canal. The Delaware senator had undergone an extensive vetting process as a typical vice presidential search, but the call was still unexpected. I expected without hesitation, Biden told the New York Times. It felt good to say yes. Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee for the president, is expected to announce his own running mate in the upcoming weeks, ahead of the party's convention in mid-August. He reported that he plans to name a woman, going to as far as describe specific people. Here are 12 women who are likely in his running. The former presidential candidates. Biden could be considering former presidential competitors Senator Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. Senator Amy Klobuchar withdrew from the process in June. Warren represents the more progressive wing of the party. Choosing the Massachusetts senator could entice a wider voter base and aim toward a sought-after unity ticket. Harris tops many prediction lists, including the Washington Post. She was already on the campaign trail and stood with him side by side in those debates, says Laura M. Brown, Ph.D., an expert on campaign strategy at George Washington University. She had to understand Biden's platform because she was running against it, so that makes her incredibly well prepared. Then another category is the members of Congress. Analysts are also eyeing a number of Congresswomen for the VP slot. According to the New York Times, a black woman give the critical support of the African American woman had given to the Democrats in recent elections, especially during the 2016 midterms, which flipped the House and brought the most diverse Congress in history. Ian Russell, a former deputy director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, told Business Insider that Florida Representative Val Demings, a former Orlando police chief, would be a strong pick. Demings, a House impeachment manager, endorsed Biden on March 5th and addressed the rumors 2 days later. I am pretty honored that my name is being mentioned in those circles, she said. There are a lot of amazing women of color that could rise to the occasion. One such woman is California Representative Karen Bass, the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, who was also on Biden's short list. Then it says the government patriots. At a November 2019 town hall, a reporter asked Biden who he might pick as his vice president. He mentioned a woman who had been the governor of Georgia, a reference to Stacey Abrams, who had lost the state congressional race by a narrow margin. Her opponent, now Governor Brian Kemp, purged more than 1.4 million voters from voter rolls during his tenure as Secretary of State 2012-2018. Abrams, who delivered the 2019 Democratic response to the State of the Union address, has since become a figurehead in the fight against voter suppression and founded the organization Far Right 2020. Susan E. Rice has also made the list. The governors. Two nearly elected governors, both from swing states, also make our long list. In New Mexico, Michelle Lucan Justman became the country's first Democratic Latina governor. I butchered names anyway. When she was elected in 2018. In Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer led the state's first all-female statewide ticket into the office in 2018. In the past few months, she gained national attention for her strong response to coronavirus. And I'll read some comments before I go on to the next article about potential vice presidents for Joe Biden. I'll go up to Ron's comments about Tulsi here. She is not anti-war because she has chosen to remain in uniform, which means she is still supporting the mission of perpetual war. And then Ron says, also that she can collect her pension after retiring from the Guard. She is not sincere. I would argue that no politician is really sincere, so I don't know exactly what to say to that, but the fact that she's still willing to stay in uniform and still support anti-war efforts is kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to that. And hello, some Dove, as he says, say no to Sleepy Joe 2020. Again, that should be a t-shirt. Good slogan there. And then hello, KRM20, as they say they are campaigning for such a stressful job. That is very true. A vice president isn't exactly, if you're talking about vice president, but even president for that matter, he's not necessarily a very easy job. That's why you always have the funny pictures of like Obama or Bush or even Trump about when they go into presidency and then when they come out of presidency, as it's obviously such a drastic difference from the two scenarios. And then Ron says, vote for Joe, let your mind go. And then Ron says, vote blue no matter who. And then Lonesome Dove said, don't kill the U.S. if you vote for Sleepy Joe. You're doing that. Ron then goes, vote for Joe in the value of the U.S. dough. And then Lonesome Doves all says, we will not be here after the election if Sleepy Joe is elected. World War III for sure if Sleepy Joe elected. We will be a condemnation of the 16-year-old Obama plan. Yeah, Obama is seen as such a big leader within the community, especially he's considered within a Democratic movement to be such a huge leader for the involvement of what happened. I'm not sure exactly what I wanted to say there, but you get the point. Obama is somebody that is considered to be a huge leader within the Democratic Party and within the Democratic candidates as a whole. And he's not, I don't know if he necessarily did all that he could have or even did that much while he was in office. And it's just something that is rather interesting to think of. But Joe Biden, as a lot of comedians have said and others have said, I don't know exactly what he has done in his 16 years or as many years of being in the Senate or being involved in government. He hasn't exactly done that much. And what he has done has kind of been somewhat detrimental. And what Ron likes to talk about a lot with his passing of drug laws and others that have really affected minority communities. But once again, thank you, KRM20 and Lonesome Dove, for commenting. I greatly appreciate that as well. And if you like the comment and if you like the content, I would highly suggest a follow. Not that I'm trying to. Anyway, you get the point. It just sounds so weird to say that stuff. But anyway, Keisha Lance Bottoms, a possible Biden VP pick, sees profitable rise in aimed crisis. And this is from NPR. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, one of the several candidates said to be under consideration as Joe Biden's presidential running mate, has seen her profile rise fast in recent weeks as the first-term mayor has spoken out against the state of Georgia Republican-led pandemic resource and spoken forcefully to protest in her city. Her early loyalty to the former vice president also stands out. Bottoms endorsed Biden more than a year ago. I think that this is not a conventional year, she said, a Democratic presidential debate in Atlanta in November. In a conventional year, you wait and you lick your finger and you stick it up. You see which way the wind is blowing. We don't have time for that this year. She traveled the country, stumping for Biden, arguing he is a statesman and the one to beat President Trump. Torrin Johnson, an advisor to her mayoral campaign and the Southern Regional Director for Barack Obama 2020 campaign, said Bottoms was with Biden before it was cool to be. And she stayed committed to his campaign even when it looked like his chance for becoming the nominee for the Democratic Party was bleak, Johnson said. That's got to count for something. Aimed at the pandemic, Bottoms has criticized Republican Governor Brian Kemp's coronavirus response and has moved forward with the state's early reopening and more recently has declined the issue to statewide mask ordinance. On Wednesday, Bottoms joined a handful of cities flouting with state decision and issued a mask mandate in Atlanta, even though Kemp's order technically supersedes local emergency action. Her handling of protests in the wake of George Floyd's death was also put her in the spotlight. A late-night May press conference after previously peaceful Atlanta protesters had begun destroying buildings, Bottom pleaded with them to go home. If you care about the city, then go home, she said forcefully. If you want change in America, go and register to vote. You are disgracing our city. You are disgracing the life of George Floyd and every other person who has been killed in this country. And thank you, KRM, for the follow. And have I missed something on YouTube here? Oh, yeah, YouTube. Sorry about that. I'll see from Mr. Supper Pack Pig, and this is why I want to set up the chat pod with Ed and make sure that everything is working fine. As he says, I would like to see Val Demings. She's from a swing state and has law enforcement reform experience. Tulsi had anti-gay and anti-choice positions make it hard to trust that she's passed a basic litmus test. And that is similar to kind of what Ron was saying as well, or I believe what Ron was referring to. I don't want to put words in Ron's mouth, obviously, but Tulsi isn't exactly 100% truthful as a candidate either. I don't really know too much about Val, so I can't 100% go from what Val has said or exactly who Val is. But I might look into Val a little bit more after reading these articles just to kind of understand who she is. And thank you again for your comment, Mr. Supper. And I would appreciate if you follow me on YouTube or subscribe to me on YouTube as well. I don't want to keep pushing that as much, but it's just super weird to say still. But anyway. And then I'll continue on here. I have been there. Bottoms, a mother of 4 children, said that she thanks the message resonated because Atlanta has led on social justice issues, going back to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and also she speaks from personal experience. I have been there, she said. I have a nephew who was murdered. I know what it feels like to lose someone suddenly to senseless violence. I know what it feels like to experience racism. Bottoms grew up as the daughter of a famous singer, Major Lance, but he ended up serving 3 years in prison for selling and possessing cocaine. And her mother struggled to support their family and keep a small business afloat in Atlanta. She was also a lawyer, then served as a magistrate judge and on the Atlanta City Council for 2 terms before winning the mayoral race in 2017. Former advisor Johnson said Bottom's reliability, drawn from her range from life experience, is the key to her success. I think just a black woman who understands what it feels like to be middle class, but also poor in Atlanta. He also pointed to the way she announced her positive coronavirus test this week. She could easily been selfish and not told anyone and tried to cover it up, Johnson said. But did she do? But what did she do? She came out and said, look, it's hit home and I want people to know that the pandemic is real. And it goes on to talk a little bit about why Bottoms might be the perfect candidate for Biden's vice president list. And you could read on that more if you want to learn more about Keisha Lance Bottoms. But I'm going to go on to this next short list from CNN about who potentially might be Joe Biden's best Democratic vice president nominee, are essentially who his options are, according to this CNN article. Number 10 is Karen Bass, the California Democrat who also chairs the Congressional Black Caucus, is the newest entrant into these ranks, propelled by favorable reviews from across the political spectrum, as well as her performance on racial issues that she hauls from a vote-rich California doesn't hurt either. Tammy Baldwin, the senator from Wisconsin, hosted an event with Biden on Wednesday focused on potential treatments and a vaccine timeline for COVID-19, and we know she is being vetted for the job, and out of the Midwestern states, Biden would like to win in 2020. Jenna, I don't know her last name. The more Biden looks like a winner, and right now he very much does, the more likely it is he is to go for a governor pick rather than one that helps in a certain state. Enter Jeanne, the governor of Rhode Island, who not only has won plaintiffs and ratification of Straits Baratheski, but also shares Biden's pragmatic, results-oriented approach to policies. And thank you, KRM, for donating a lemon. I greatly appreciate that on DLive. And here we go. Elizabeth Warren. I know that other VP rankings have the senator from Massachusetts as far more likely to be Biden's pick than I do. I am far more skeptical that Biden goes this route. Yes, Warren is a national figure in her own right and beloved by liberals, but she is also someone whose political style is at odds with Biden and who is significantly more liberal than he is on most issues. Plus, in the era where race is a huge issue, there's a white man who wants to pick a white woman as his running mate to lead the Democratic Party. 6. Tammy Duckworth. While I have been pointing to the senator from Illinois as the likeliest dark horse in the Veep stakes for months now, she finally got a major burst from national attention over the past weeks thanks to Fox News and Tucker Carlson. Carlson called Duckworth a moron for suggesting she was open to a conversation about removing statues of George Washington and lumped her in with those who actually hate America. Those words rang particularly hollow and offensive given Duckworth received a Purple Heart and lost both of her legs when the helicopter she was piloting was shot down over Iraq. Duckworth's response to Carlson was pitch perfect. Does Tucker Carlson want to walk a mile on my legs and then tell me whether or not I love America? 5. Val Demings. And I'll probably butcher her last name every single time here, but that's just what I do. So we'll continue on here. The Florida Congresswoman shot to prominence nationally thanks to a unique resume that includes a stint as chief of police in Orlando of late. However, her time spent in that job has slowed the momentum behind her possible selection as Biden's VP. As Vox recently noted in a piece on Demings, critics say Demings was part of a broader culture of violence in policing that's present in Orlando and beyond, according to an investigation of use of force incidents by the Orlando Scimitar that was published in 2015. The Orlando Police Department in 2010 engaged in 20% more the use of force indicates than Baton Rouge, a city of comparable size and population. Number 4, Michelle Grisham. God, I butchered that. Unlike some of the other women on this list on the national cable TV, almost every night about the news of the day, Grisham is taking a much more down-home approach to the Veep stakes. The New Mexico governor is one of the highest-ranking Latino officials in the country, has stayed lesser focused on her home state response to coronavirus. 3. Susan Rice. The more experience in making the the levers of government work for people becomes a topic of conversation of nationality, the better Rice prospects look. The former ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor during Obama's administration has unparalleled experience in how government works and when it doesn't, plus she has a long relationship with Biden than anyone else on the list. Keisha Lance Bottoms. The Atlanta mayor announced earlier this week that she has contracted COVID-19, rising her potential stake in the fight against the virus. The experience with the disease that is almost certainly going to top of the mind from voters certainly going to be the top of the mind for voters come November, lends to her voice that much more power nationally, and it closes the gap even more between the top two lists on the spot. And then lastly, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris, same as it ever was, the senator from California, is still the betting favorite to Biden's pick because she has more pluses than anyone else on the list. She's black and Indian American woman from a massive Democratic state in terms of votes and campaign dollars, who has also been on the national stage these past 18 months. Previous ranking 1. So that was a full list of potential Democratic candidates that Joe Biden could pick for his vice presidency of the topic at hand. And I do think that it's going to be interesting to see which pick Democratic nominee Joe Biden ends up going with. Because you obviously have the top options of being a woman of color. And obviously I don't think that's going to be a surprise if Joe Biden ends up going that way. And it'll be interesting to hear his perspective of why he picks who he picks. And I do think that Kamala Harris is a strong likely, although I think Ed and some others don't necessarily think that Joe Biden is going to go that route. I didn't really know much about Lance Bottoms. I did know about Susan Rice. And I'll look a little bit more into Val from the YouTube commenter and others about why Val might be a smart pick for Joe Biden. But that leads me to my next topic, but I'll take a quick little drink break before we move on. This next topic is about sports. And obviously I talked a little bit about NFL and Colin Kaepernick in my last podcast episode. But I wanted to give a few more updates on what has come of the Redskins and changing their name. The CEO, I guess you would say, or the owner of the Redskins is willing to change their name. And the Navajo Nation president offers Washington NFL team a Redskin name replacement, and this is from Newsweek. The NFL Washington franchise got pushed and nudged to change its nickname for more than half a century. The tactics by protesters and boycotters had little effect. Well, within the past few weeks, the team finally got strong-armed into nixing both the Redskins and their logo. Now the team formerly known as the Washington Redskins, which announced Monday it was retiring both the nickname and logo, is looking for a new moniker. Popular options floating around include the Red Tails and Red Wolves. Jonathan Naz, who is the Navajo Nation president, offered up a suggestion, the Washington Code Talkers. Naz said in the press release that Monday, July 13th, were historic and that the NFL team could help further educate fans by naming their team after a group of Native Americans who worked to help win World War II. July 13, 2020 is now a historic day for all indigenous people around the world, and as the NFL Washington-based team officially announced the retirement of the racist and disparaging Redskins team name and logo, Naz said, renaming the team the Code Talkers to honor the Navajo, I think it's Navajo, I could be wrong, but Talkers, and other tribal nations who used their sacred language to help win World War II, would set the team on path to restoring its reputation and correcting the historical misreputation of the indigenous peoples. Navajo Marines furiously used their own language, which wouldn't be decoded by the Japanese, to help American military locate Pacific battlefields during the war. about 400 Navajos joined the U.S. Marines to help slug it out during the Pacific theater of the war. This included fierce battles at Guantanamo, Idaho Jimmy, and Antarctica. I butchered all of that, that's true. Anyway, the Washington Redskins first became an NFL franchise in 1932. Daniel Snyder, the team's current owner, vowed in 2013 he would never change the team's name. Things changed over the past 6 weeks, along with other social justice and racial equality measures that led to the franchise even considering changing its name. And then it goes on to talk about why. But as I discussed on my last podcast, I think the main reason to the Redskins wanting to change their name was simply because of money. And money is a great motivator when it comes to how business is done. Essentially, as my former teacher used to say in business, he said just simply follow the money and you will most often see the motive of a business or any other place in that account. And that's something that is very interesting. So I do think that it could be as simple as that, but it's going to be interesting to see what name the Redskins will ultimately go with their new name. And you could argue that the changing of a name is rather silly, and I think I tend to kind of go along that line because it's similar to the issue of statues that I think a lot of people have, and that is simply a statue is just a statue. It's just brick, it's just stone, it's just whatever, it's just there, and that's a name. And a lot of people aren't really offended by statues or names, but the people who shouldn't necessarily be devalued as well. So it is interesting from that perspective too. And this is from Sporting News. There are 5 options for the Redskins name change, from Warriors to the Red Tails. The Washington NFL franchise announced Monday morning the team is retiring the term Redskins. Washington Redskins Twitter. And this was a release. On July 3rd, we announced that the commitment of thorough review of the team's name. The review has begun in earnest. As part of the process, we want to keep our sponsors, fans, and community appraised of our thinking as we go forward. Anyway, today we are announcing we will be retiring the Redskins name and logo upon completion of this review. Dan Snyder and Coach Rivera are working closely to develop a new name and design approach that will enhance the standing of our proud tradition, rich franchise, and inspire our sponsors, fans, and community for the next 100 years. This comes after a week of FedEx formally asked team owner Dan Snyder to change the name. FedEx is a primary sponsor of the team and holds the naming rights to the FedEx Field where the Washington plays. That same day, Nike removed apparel from its websites that included the word Redskins apparel from every NFL team. Dan Snyder and Coach Ravana Pera are working closely to develop a new name and design approach that will enhance the standing of our period and tradition, as it said on the post. If Washington is to change its franchise name, then the team should follow at Paramount Designs. And it goes on to talk about a little bit about what the name could change to, and some posts that people have made for logos and type of design that honestly looks a lot similar to what the Redskins already had, just maybe a little less tame compared to it beforehand. But I wanted to get to this next article before we move on to our last main topics here. Before we get into our last main topics, and that is with this Washington Redskins fan. And he did something that was rather interesting as he decided to kind of change our trademark names. And I'll just read into the article before we go on to there. And I see Ed's comment on YouTube as he says, Washington Orange Man. Well, that would be in reference to Donald Trump, so I don't know if they want to do that. But good name. I appreciate that. Washington Van Hobby could result in trademark tussle with the NFL team, and this is on ESPN. It started as a joke, then turned into a hobby. 6 years later, it also turned Martin McCauley into potentially a key player in Washington's quest to trademark a new name for the football team. McCarty has filed 44 different trademark applications of names. Washington optimistically could choose its latest filling on July 8th, the Washington Red Wolves, that joins a list including Red Tails, Monuments, Veterans, Red Tail Hawks, Americans, Braves, and there's also the Freedom Fighters and the Redskins. Washington announced on Monday it had retired its previous name and might not be nameless for too long. It also might be trying to trademark a name that Macari might own or one for has already been submitted in an application. They will probably use one of many names, he said. In 2014, when speculation forced on a new name change in Washington NFL's team, McCarthy noticed people filing for trademark applications on what he considered joke names, so he joined in, registering for the name Washington Pigskins. A love for the trademark application was born, which application cost $275, which he considers the cost of his hobby. The 61-year-old Archery, who has also written books on real estate, lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and is a fan of the Washington team. But Mercari says the money he saves from not attending games gets spent on trademarks. In many cases, the fan who submitted for trademarks let the application die because they have no intent on doing anything commercially with the name. But Mercari took it one step further, buying 100 pigskin coffee mugs and putting them for sale online to meet the requirement that helped get the name registered. He also said the NFL trademark attorney sent him a letter saying that they would allow the name. As he collected, Macabry added to his merchandise to make it appear as if he was using the trademark. He created a website, WashingtonAmericanFootball.com, to sell his wires. But he really had no interest in the hustle of doing so. He didn't want the headaches of packing up the goods and shipping them and collecting income tax, so he abandoned these efforts. I said, if you want to come get this stuff, it's free, he said. I give the rest to charity. I kept a few mugs and coasters. I lost interest in the hobby and never sold anything. The trademarks are good as long as the trademark owner is using it for commerce, and trademarks don't allow for squatter rights. Because of the renewed talk about the Washington's name, McCaffrey again showed interest in the trademark game. He got back to work. He checked the odds on various names and snatched up what he could. In some ways, he could present a hurdle for the Washington, but he also could make the franchise life easier as if he wants one of those names. McCaffrey said on July 4th, he told NFL via email it could have its trademarks for free, he said in the lead, never responded. And then Ron here has a couple of name suggestions, as he says, Washington Yellow Streaks, Washington Yellow, Washington Crazy Cats, Washington Knuckleheads, Washington Lapdogs, Washington Spineheads, Washington Ding Dongs. Yeah, those are all pretty good ones. I like them. I think you should, Washington Politically Correct. That's a good one. I think they should probably go with Washington Politically Correct. I think that's the best one out of those names, Ron. I think you might want to trademark that. I think that's a very good possibility they'll go with that one. And this goes on and on and on to talk about what he did. But basically, he's trademarking names for the idea that the NFL could potentially want one of those trademark names. But at the same time, he doesn't necessarily have selfish motives, at least yet, to make the NFL pay to get that trademark from him. He's offering it for free, but it's still a rather interesting idea that could potentially cause some harm if he decides to capitalize on a more monetary value of the name. And I'm not really going to spend too much time on this article. I more wanted to show the article, and it is linked because it does bring up a good point. And it's more a point I just wanted to talk out loud than read the article for. But the article talks about how the NFL and its political motives and political past, basically how NFL has done all these political gestures, such as the Black National Anthem and endorsing Colin Kaepernick a little bit more than usual. It could potentially make people's interest in the NFL a lot less. As Ed has said on his channel and many times, he's a diehard Packer fan, and he's also somebody that likes to watch football in general, he's able to turn his mind off. And that's the same for me, as I'm able to just sit back and kind of turn my mind off. And it's something that is very interesting and very good, and something I like and enjoy. But I think a lot of people are simply just aggravated that the NFL is willing to go so political so fast and make a sport that a lot of people are just able to relax and enjoy into a political gesture. And I do think that the NFL could potentially lose a lot of fans, like my grandpa, who already has decided to no longer watch NFL due to simply the kneeling and gesture relating to that. So it is possible that the NFL could lose a lot of viewers. But that brings me to my final two topics. And the first one is an idea about George Floyd, and a transcript from the article from the officer's body camera has been shown. So, from the information we have had beforehand, the evidence of the video makes it look like an outright murder, and I would argue that it is an outright murder from the looks of just the video. But obviously, we don't know about everything as of yet. We don't have the full videos. And as many people have speculated on their shows and other things, it does seem rather odd that we don't have all the evidence you would necessarily think you would need to go about addressing a full-on issue. In other words, there seemed to be more evidence about what exactly happened beforehand than just the video that was shown from people's cameras. So I was going to read some of this transcript that is showed in the article, because it does seem a little bit suspicious, and it does seem like Floyd was under the influence of drugs at the time. And actually, well, I'll read the transcript, but it does seem a little bit odd from the facts just off of hand. In other words, just what we have seen on the video and just from what I've said may not be the full truth, and there might actually be some details around it. As it says, Lane, I am not going to shoot you. Step away, step out and face away. Floyd. Floyd. I will look at you eye to eye, man. Please don't shoot me, man. Lane, I'm not shooting you, man. Lloyd, I just lost my mom, man. Lane asked a witness, Shiana Reese Hall, why Floyd is acting erratic. Lane, why is he getting all squirrely and not showing us his hands and just being all weird like? Hill, I have no clue. Maybe he's been shot before. Lane, well, I get that, but still, when officers say get out of his car, he is drunk. He is on something. Hill, no, he got thing going on. I'm telling you about the police. Lane, what does that mean? Hill, he have problems all the time when they come. Especially when that man put the gun like that. He's been one. As officers are trying to get Floyd into his squad car, he repeatedly tells him he's calorostropic and asks them to crack a window. In other words, he can't really breathe very well. So he was already feeling like he couldn't breathe before he was being knelt on his neck on the video that we've all have seen. Y'all, I'm going to die in here. I'm going to die, man. I just had COVID-19, man. I don't want to go back to that, Floyd says. Lane tells Floyd Lane tells Floyd he will roll the windows down and turn the air conditioning on. Floyd tells the officer several times that he cannot breathe and says he wants to lay on the ground. Prior to getting Floyd to the ground, he says he cannot breathe multiple times. At the same point, Derek Chauvin and Todd Tayo arrive on the scene. The officers bring Floyd to the ground, where he continues to say he cannot breathe. He repeatedly cries out for his mother and says, "Tell my kids I love them. I am dead." "You are doing a lot of talking, man," Chauvin tells him. At one point, Lane asks, "Should we roll him onto his side?" Chauvin replies, "No, he's staying put where we got him." Lane, "Okay, just worry about the excited whatever our Chauvin. Well, that's why we got the ambulance coming." Lane, "Okay, I suppose." Lane asks again a short time later, "Shall we roll him on his side?" EMS arrived to check on Floyd. Lane asks the paramedics, "You want one of us to ride with?" And he goes into the ambulance to help with CPR. One of the paramedics asks Lane what's going on. Lane replies that why they respond to a forgery report that Floyd just not compliment with getting out of the car. We are trying to get him in the back of the squad, and he was just basically resisting. He wasn't showing us his hands at first. Then we were trying to get him into the squad. He kicked his way out. He was kicking on there. And we came out to the other side, and he was fighting us. And we were just basically restrained him under you guys got here, Lane says. Floyd was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Lance, Keenan, and Theo are also facing 2 charges, each of aiding and abetting. Shaving the officer seen on bystander video kneeling on Floyd's neck as he struggled to breathe, is charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. So that was the transcript of the incident and what happened from George Floyd's death. And it is something that is rather interesting and something that gives us a little bit more of a perspective of exactly what happened with George Floyd. And it might not be just as simple as it looked on the video as an outright murder. But at the same time, it still was wrong for the officer to be kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for that amount of time, even if the person was under the influence of drugs or whatever else he was under the influence of. But it does give a slightly new perspective of what happened and a little more detailed perspective of what happened, because we do have to not just close our minds on one motive and one perspective of what happened, but rather open our minds to everything that might be included within the death of George Floyd and any other incident like it. Now, the last article was something I wanted to talk about and read from, and that was from Fox News, and it states, North Carolina City approves reparations, apologize for role in slavery. The council voted 7-0 on a measure to mitigate racial disparities, by Morgan Phillips. North Carolina Asheville City Council apologized for its role in slavery and racial discrimination, voting unanimously to provide reparations in the form of community investments to help black residents. The council voted 7-0 on Tuesday night on the measure to mitigate racial disparities. The reparations will not provide direct cash payments, as some have suggested, but will provide investments in housing, healthcare, and career growth in black neighborhoods. Councilwoman Chiveki Smith, who is black, said the council had gotten emails from those asking why would we pay for what happened during slavery. Slavery is the institution that serves as the starting point for the building a strong economic floor for white America, while attempting to keep blacks subordinate forever through its progress, said Smith. She also reported by the Asheville Citizen-Times. The resolution calls on the city to create community reparation commissions to make concrete recommendations of where to funnel programs and resources. The resulting budgetary and programmatic properties may include, but not be limited to, increasing minority home ownership and access to other affordable housing, increasing minority business ownership and career opportunities, strategies to grow equality and general wealth, closing the gaps in healthcare, education, employment, and pay, neighborhood safety, and fairness within the criminal justice, the resolution reads. Hundreds of years of black blood spilled that specifically fills the cup we drink from today, said Councilwoman Keith Young, who was one of 2 African American city council members and spearheaded the proposal. It is simply not enough to remove statues. Black people in this country are dealing with issues that is systemic in nature, Young continued. Councilwoman Kapoor, who is known to split with Smith and Young on police and budget issues, said he supported the resolution for more reasons, but urged the skeptics to look at partial reason and data showing large disparities between African Americans and other Asheville residents. And it goes on, and that was the end of the article there. But the main point was reparations as a whole. So obviously some people have had family members in the past that have owned slaves. But at the same time, lots of people have had family members in the past who have simply have not owned slaves. So by making it mandatory that people pay money, or in the case people aid based off of just race, is purely racist. And it is very concerning that something like this were to get passed. But at the same time, from a perspective of, I guess you would say, a libertarian, or a perspective of local government, it is important that this becomes a local issue rather than just a nationwide issue. If the nation were to make the same reparation vote through, let's say, the Supreme Court or something, it's a lot more concerning than just the local community. But at the same time, the fact that this is getting done is just simply appalling to me, and does seem to have racial motives, even if the fact of doing so doesn't appear to be racially motivated. So it is something that is rather interesting, and something I've been watching out for to see if any other local communities talk about reparations as this article talks about, and as this community has voted to do so, and the impact that some of the citizens might have from it, because it did just happen, or at least this article had just been made. So that is all the articles I had today for today's podcast, but I thought I would end again thanking Ron Helton, Ed, KRM20, and Lowsome Dove, and also on YouTube, Ron again, Ed again, and Mr. Supper Pat. I highly appreciate and really enjoy your comments. It does make the stream and podcast go by a lot better. And I do really appreciate you all being there, and hope you'll join me on my next podcast. Again, I won't have a podcast for 12 days as I will be on a backpacking trip, but I will have a podcast once I return for my third episode. So I'm sorry for that. I won't have a podcast for the next 12 days, but I will have some videos on my YouTube channel, Roundtable Decision, if you want to check out those as well. And once I'm back, I will make the podcast, as I just said. But I also wanted to shout out Freedom Scoop one more time. It's freedomscoop.com. There you can check out the Generational Gap, Ed, Stephen and Garamus, Already Conservative. If you like this content, you'll probably like theirs. And I highly appreciate if you check them out as well. But that is the end of the Breakdown with Berckenhoff episode 2. And I would like to kind of end with a general question for everybody. And that is simply, how much do you trust the government? And do you think that the government is using masks and other sort of issues within the political spectrum to control people fully through the act of government? So essentially, I want to end with a question of, do you think that the government is passing laws for your safety, or simply just trying to control you fully? And that brings me to the question of my episode that I mentioned in the beginning, and I'm mentioning now. Is the government doing it for safety or control? Thank you very much, and